Aliens on Planet Earth. The true story of the origins of humanity. Introduction. We chose this topic to shed light on a fascinating theory. Has the human genetic makeup or nature ever been altered? In the history of human beings, has there ever been an act of genetic engineering that has modified our DNA to create what we know as the modern human being? Writers such as Zecharia Sitchin and Eric von Daniken believe this theory to be true. The question, however, arises, who would these genetic engineers be? Extraterrestrial life forms? But above all, why would an alien life form modify the genetic substance of another species without adequately considering the social effects that such a modification would entail? Furthermore, if an alien species, a deity, or anything else were capable of manipulating the genetic material of another species, it would surely be aware of its actions and the risks that such an action would entail. Yet human history leads us to believe that this genetic transformation took place without an adequate consideration from the higher entity responsible regarding the social effects of this transformation. Therefore, if we believe that some manipulation of our genetic structure has indeed occurred, it must have been carried out either by a rather primitive and ignorant entity, which is unlikely considering the technology required, or by an evil entity or force indifferent to the consequences of their actions. All of this may seem improbable or too difficult to comprehend, but if we consider the myths and legends that abound in the history of mankind, they all seem to include stories of genetic interference of this type. The Gnostics believe that human beings contain within them a portion of God, the supreme good or divine spark, which has fallen from the immaterial world into the bodies of men, or that they have been trapped by a powerful evil deity, demiurge, within the material world, the physical world, which is subject to decay, petrification, and death. Sitchin argues that an alien race, the Anunnaki, genetically engineered humanity as a slave species, but early humans rebelled and consequently developed a consciousness. Numerous myths, stories, and legends suggest that someone or something interfered with the ape to create man, and this creation is generally interpreted as something negative. Anunnaki's manipulation. 350,000 years ago, a highly advanced extraterrestrial race, known as the Anunnaki, arrived on planet Earth with the purpose of forming new colonies that would allow them to conquer Earth and mine minerals such as gold, copper, and silver. King Anu entrusted his sons to take care of the expansion of the colonies, appointing his eldest son, Enlil, in charge of planet Earth, and his other son, Enki, to oversee everything that happened in the waters and seas. Back then, planet Earth did not have the same environmental and topographical conditions as today. It actually presented many more obstacles. Hence, the Anunnaki projects were more difficult than initially expected to carry out. For this reason, a council was set up among the chiefs of Nibiru to help the Anunnaki. The final decision was to send a race known as the Igigis from Nibiru to help work on the projects on planet Earth under Anunnaki leadership. The Igigis are an inferior race. They worked on Earth for 2,500 years, extracting minerals such as gold, copper, silver, and other precious metals, and they were also in charge of building bases, colonies, and spaceports. In order to do this, they had to change the topography of the planet, and above all, provide water and fertile land to the new metropolises. Therefore, they operated by diverting the currents of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as to conduct water to the new Anunnaki colonies throughout Mesopotamia. This meant years of labor, slavery, and subjugation. For this reason, the Igigis, now fed up and tired, decided to rebel against the Anunnaki. They organized themselves and ceased working on all projects, destroyed their tools and work machines, armed themselves, and marched to the royal palace of Enlil. Enlil was tasked with overseeing everything that happened on Earth, including the labor of the Igigis. For this reason, the Igigis made their way to his palace with the aim of assassinating Enlil in laying the groundwork for a revolution. The guards at Enlil's palace warned him in time of what was going on outside. Enraged, he called his men to arms to fight against the rebels. However, the servant Nuska convinced him to set up a diplomatic assembly so that a peaceful solution could be found without any bloodshed. The Igigis chose representatives to attend the assembly, which was also attended by some Anunnaki leaders, including Anu, Enki, Insurag, and Enlil. The latter participated in the company of his royal page Nuska, Kalkal, and Enuji. When the Igigis finished complaining about the slavery they were subjected to, King Anu didn't speak at first, but rather Enki himself, the hybrid prince, took a stand on behalf of the Igigis, realizing and admitting that the Anunnaki had indeed adopted a very oppressive attitude towards them. Enki convinced the Anunnaki leaders to free the Igigis and look for another alternative to continue working on planet Earth. The decision was to create a new slave race, external to Nibiru and inferior in every sense, but who would still be intelligent enough and have the ability to continue the work on Earth successfully, while at the same time serve and be grateful to its creators. The Anunnaki leaders entrusted this task to Ninhursag, an expert in genetic engineering like Enki, and both were then assigned to carry out this new project in the Nippur laboratory, which the ancients referred to as the meat factory. In this place, Enki and Ninhursag extracted their DNA and analyzed their entire genomic chain so that it could be assembled into DNA of another race in order to create a physically inferior but quite intelligent and capable hybrid race. So Enki and Ninhursag took some of the primitive men who roamed in those years, describing them as naked men who knew neither bread nor clothing, and used them to experiment the hybridization of this new race. These were specimens of Homo erectus. It was a very complicated job that took some time to perfect. The first results gave birth to deformed beings who did not possess the appropriate skills to work or think, with problems with their joints and difficulty walking. Until one day, Enki and Ninhursag arrived at the correct DNA balance between the two races by artificially joining chromosomes 2 and 3 of the Homo erectus, reducing the chromosomal pairs from 24 to 23, and mixing them in the clay or in the uterus of those Anunnaki women who were tasked with birthing. The word clay is a term that refers to the womb of Anunnaki women in charge of giving birth to the new hybrid race. It was basically artificial insemination. The plan seemed to work well, and when the month of conception arrived, cesarean sections were performed. The text described that Ninhursag unsheathed the blade with which he opened the wombs of Anunnaki women, then cut the umbilical cords, and saw that his hybridization experiment had finally succeeded. This new breed turned out to be black in color, which is why they were called Sejigaga, translated as blackheads. Even the gods referred to them simply as blacks. The result of the project was presented to Enlil, who approved it and enslaved new humans under his control. Sumerian and Mesopotamian writings in general date this process of genetic intervention to about 350,000 years ago. The Anunnaki, when they first came to Earth, knew of the existence of a living species, a primitive being with little, almost zero intellectual abilities, the Homo erectus. The Anunnaki, as we have already stated, decided to intervene genetically and gave rise to the Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, therefore, were born this way. There was no precursor or evolution of the species. This is due to the genetic engineering work we mentioned before, carried out by Enki and Ninhursag, in which through a process of genetic modification on some specimens of Homo erectus, they grouped chromosomes 2 and 3 with the telomere-telomere fusion, which is completely unnatural. We are the only race on planet Earth to have this highly complex fusion, and we are the only hominids to have 23 pairs of chromosomes instead of 24, found in present-day hominids and other ancestral hominid races. In fact, according to canonical science, our biological classification belongs to the animal kingdom, specifically mammals. However, other mammals don't behave like us at all. Our behavior is so unique that it aligns with something else, something that isn't living at all. Mammals have specific characteristics that set them apart from other animals. There are different types of groups of mammals, such as bats, carnivores, cetaceans, elephants, marsupials, primates, rodents, and more. They are found all over the world and in all types of different climates. They nurse their young with breast milk, maintain a constant core temperature, protect their offspring, have hair, a more developed brain, and many other common physical characteristics. All mammals instinctively try to maintain a natural balance with their ecosystem. They produce only up to a certain limit, so they don't usurp the natural resources of their environment. The modern human being does not follow any of the above behaviors. Human beings destroy the natural balance of the environment in which they live in, and indeed expend energy and resources to destroy their environment and even their own bodies. They reproduce to the point of exceeding, by a lot, the capacity of the natural resources of the environment that hosts them. Behaviorally, no other mammals do what humans do. There's only one other organism that mimics our behavior: viruses. Viruses crept into the genome of our ancestors hundreds of millions of years ago, when our DNA was mixed with that of the Anunnaki. There are over 100,000 known virus fragments in the human genome. They make up more than 8% of our DNA. And, in correlation with this, we must take into account that the thousands of genetic diseases that are transmitted through sexual intercourse are a serious trace of the fact that our evolution has been manipulated in an unscrupulous and at the same time very rapid way. Natural evolution itself would not allow the inheritance of diseases through sexual reproduction. Our genome and DNA are not perfect, nor are they in good condition because of the modifications and alterations they underwent a long time ago. Ancient writings did not narrate the creation of man from out of nothing. There are dozens of cultures that tell how human beings originated thanks to the intervention of two gods who mixed their DNA with that of some primitive hominids. What our ancestors wrote in archaic language is nothing more than a description of a genetic procedure worked out by the Anunnaki gods to create a race of slaves. Most scientists and historians investigate our origins based on classical, canonical theories, according to which we'll never know our true history and what really happened. That's why there are so many evolutionary leaps and unexplained events that mainstream science simply ignores, such as the fusion of chromosomes 2 and 3, the absence of the missing evolutionary link between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, human remains found in America and Australia, and the ruins of lost civilizations. How do we explain the existence of advanced metropolises and megalithic structures all over the world from about 10,000 BC onwards, if it is assumed that at the time man didn't even master agriculture and simple tools? How did humans arrive to the Americas? How do we explain the existence of Homo sapien remains and tools dating back 130,000 years? Because, according to official science, man migrated from Africa and Asia to the American continent only in 9000 BC, to prevent us humans from discovering our true identity. The Illuminati manipulated science and invented the Freemason Darwinist theory of evolution. Among many things, they claimed that humans were spawned by apes, and that we are the only intelligent race on Earth. In the next chapter, we will go into detail regarding the Illuminati and their terrible deeds. The evil work of the Illuminati. Science and the media are relentlessly trying to convince us that man evolved from Neanderthals. It's ironic, because although we did not evolve from this primitive form, it could be said that the Illuminati who secretly rule our planet actually did. Let's reconstruct the whole story for a moment. About 150,000 years BC, the Anunnaki from the planet Nibiru created Neanderthals as a slave race for mining gold. The Anunnaki, in fact, discovered that gold, in its white powder form, had positive regenerative effects on their deteriorating DNA. However, they eventually discovered that gold produced serious long-term side effects, creating a distortion in their DNA and consciousness. Neanderthals had a genome composed of Anunnaki and monkey genes, as well as some other minor species. The Anunnaki were in possession of a genetic hybridization research program for DNA rehabilitation, and some of them, who were among those who had come to Earth in search of gold, required this bioregeneration program due to the change of atmosphere and physical exertion. The Anunnaki decided to use Neanderthals to carry out their genetic engineering experiments, as they already possessed some compatible genes. They transformed the Neanderthal, then known as Lulcus, into Luhari, or Cro-Magnon 1, then later into E. Luli Levi, Cro-Magnon 2, and again into Homo sapiens 1. Bioregeneration consisted of allowing some of the weaker Anunnaki to incarnate in these bodies. These non-human souls in human-type bodies were known as the Leviathans of Anu Melchizedek. Sadly, some of the more evil Anunnaki seized this opportunity to advance their agenda of world domination. They realized that by incarnating in human bodies, they could physically operate on Earth and more directly control the affairs of the planet. As a result, countless Anunnaki, Draconians, and other beings from other galaxies were born into these human bodies, but with a consciousness that was very different from that of humans, in that they manifested a total absence of an emotional structure and compassion, albeit possessing great mental capacities. These Leviathans, as they were called, with their kinship lines stretching from the Atlantean period to the present day, formed the Illuminati. Around 10,000 BC, the number of Leviathans was considerable, even greater than those sent on the gold mining missions. However, the most important was the nature of the souls that entered the bodies. They were non-human souls. There is a network of electrical systems on Earth, mostly underground, that were created primarily by the two main competitors, the Anunnaki and the Draconians. Although many Illuminati may think that the enslavement of the human race is the final agenda of the invaders, this is actually not the case at all. The Anunnaki, at their first opportunity, intend to install scalar pulse power plants on Earth to open the portals to the Earth's interior. This would be an important step not only towards the conquest of the planetary system, but also towards the complete assimilation of the time matrix, a sector of the universe of vital importance for intergalactic domination. These are goals that the Anunnaki have been planning for hundreds of millions of years. For them, it's a desperate attempt to prevent their slow decay. Planetary and stellar alignments for ascension and access to the inner portals occur only every planetary time cycle, i.e., every 26,556 years. There are many Illuminati, Anu Melchizedek Leviathans, currently under the control of the evading extraterrestrials who run governments, science, religion, and education. There are also good people in general who are unsuspecting victims of genetic experiments, mind control attempts, DNA experimentation, and infiltration of consciousness. During the time of Atlantis, the various factions, pushed by the corresponding extraterrestrials who controlled them, took possession of different geographical territories on Earth and installed spikes that were inserted into the Earth's grid system. These are crystalline metal implants inserted deep into the crust through photosonic pulses. The spikes act as receivers and speakers. This system is known as grid spiking and is a method of creating a network of plants to enslave society. When the spikes are activated, they create a series of mini wormholes that travel to the main great wormhole, Phoenix, in the Bermuda Triangle, and to Nibiru, the Anunnaki planet that controls Wormwood, also known as Planet X. Note that our planet is filled with electromagnetic corridors, portal systems, a universe main stargate, and the Amenti sphere, pearly celestial gates, which contains 6 different dimensional portals and the Amenti force, a frequency conversion portal. From about 10,000 BC, government buildings and places of worship were built on the spikes. Society is composed mostly of family lines of Illuminati leviathans that have been controlled by extraterrestrials for thousands of years. The Draconians copied the Anunnaki Phoenix wormhole with their Falcon wormhole in the Bermuda Triangle area. There is an ongoing war between the Draconians and the Anunnaki over these wormholes. These large systems need a stellar ascension cycle and a continuously linked energy system in order to be activated. The 1943 Philadelphia experiment was organized by the Zeta Draconians to test the progress of their Falcon activation system. In 1983, the Draconian Zetas carried out a new experiment using the Illuminati and managed to connect and activate the Falcon. In the year 2000, the Anunnaki, the Draconians, and the Necromatons formed an alliance, the UIR, United Invader Resistance. The two wormholes, Phoenix and Falcon, would have merged together in order to increase the overall power, creating enough energy to drag the entire planet Earth into the galaxy of origin of these extraterrestrial races. The Phoenix-Falcon fusion experiment, however, did not work in the end because planetary consciousness, especially through the Indigos, a special group of human beings that we will discuss further on, created a critical mass of the 12th code pulse, i.e., a D12 current, meaning a fully 12th dimensional current. Members of the UIR alliance cannot work at D12. Their DNA, in fact, only reaches 10, maximum 11 strands size. We already mentioned the Indigos, but who are they really? The concept of an indigo person was developed in the 1970s, when it was discovered that many children born in the 60s and 70s had a strong indigo aura, hence the name. Indigo children are believed to be born to a parent who has had some form of spiritual awakening during their lifetime. This realization causes their DNA to change slightly in such a way that when they have a child, that child is spiritually ready from birth. Indigos are able to draw strength and energy from the collective consciousness, which was a perfectly normal thing thousands of years ago. However, when our DNA began to learn how to store memories, many of us started relying excessively on the data contained in our memory to make decisions, instead of simply using our conscious state. DNA records and stores our cells' memories like a tape recorder. This has caused us to lose the ability to tap into our higher consciousness, and instead allows our past to make sense of the situations we find ourselves in, and thus often make incorrect subconscious decisions. When people tap into their higher consciousness, a part of their DNA is altered and strengthened. This means that the DNA that we pass on to our offspring will also store this data, allowing them to access this consciousness that will become stronger as generations pass these genes down to each other. The indigo children were the ones born to those who had access to this ability. Indigo is a very rich and deep midnight blue color, mixed with purple, which produces an aura with a very regal hue. Indigos are characterized by intuition, wisdom, spiritual knowledge, and telepathic communication. An indigo will be able to see things from a higher perspective, rather than an ego-driven personal point of view, or a point of view motivated by a financial and/or material reward. Indigos have an inner knowledge so powerful that it replaces their psychic activities when it comes to making important decisions. Rather than thinking, Indigos use their sensations to make sense of the world. They observe the electromagnetic vibrations that everyone sends out and have the ability to translate the resulting energies to better understand their surroundings. They live desperately searching for the meaning of their lives and the missing answers they often find in the hidden, subliminal messages that everyday life conveys to them. They constantly feel like fish out of water, like they were born on the wrong planet. They feel like aliens when they are in the company of other human beings who do not share the same experience and sensations as them. An indigo often doesn't need to obtain formal education qualifications to prove their intellect or abilities, and instead, will find their way to their personal success on their own. An Indigo's success begins and ends with the nurturing of his soul through service to others. For an Indigo, doing good, dedicating oneself to others, is an element of vital importance. Many of the Indigos are clairvoyant, although some of them are not fully aware of their power. Indigos want nothing more than to create harmony. They want to feel at one with the earth and want all humans, animals, and other living organisms to come together in peace. It is difficult for an Indigo to rest and relax completely when there is so much suffering on earth. Many additives added to food and beverages are intolerable for Indigos. They have a strong sensitivity to chemicals and should only ingest or use natural nutrients. This also applies to cosmetics or cleaning products, which cause sunburn or negative reactions when the skin comes into close contact with these products. An Indigo has an innate desire to serve humanity and to intervene in defense of anyone in need. They fight for equality and will do their utmost to support those who need their help or assistance. Indigos thrive on honesty and integrity. They too make mistakes, tell lies, and often stumble over weaknesses. But they have a very strong sense of what is right and wrong. And when they fail to make the right decisions, they do everything they can to redirect their actions back to the right path and rectify their wrongdoings. This was an important and necessary insight into the work of the Indigos. However, back to the main topic, in 2001, another wormhole network, Montauk Phoenix, was activated. This was done using scalar sonic pulses. These subsonic pulses are known for their dangerous diffusion. As a result, it was already predicted that the most important buildings, such as the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, which contain the sites of the first spikes underneath them, would collapse sooner or later. However, the destruction of the buildings was part of a larger plan, and the terrorist decoy excuse was created for the purpose of generating further conflict, mass psychological fear, and another war, particularly pitting countries against each other, depending on whether or not they sided with the newly formed anti-terrorism coalition or not. The subsonic scalar pulses that activate wormholes are the consequence of a well-defined process. First, the combination of electromagnetic waves calibrated to specific angles of the planet. Subsequently, the emission of a special electric charge that hits these electromagnetic waves and gives rise to the muon, the 4D particle that's smaller than a proton. Then the subspace sonic pulses of these muons are directed towards the target, i.e. the wormhole. They finally diffuse the energy emanating from the wormhole through a complex amplification system. The extraterrestrial message. We and everything around us are made up of stellar matter, nitrogen in our DNA, calcium in our teeth, iron in our blood. All of this constitutes our genetic makeup. If we could collect all the atoms that make us up, mix them in a large bowl and shake them for as long as we want, in the end, we just obtain a boring hodgepodge of atoms. So how did we evolve into what we are today? Whether it was the result of a long process of trial and error, or a careful divine design, today's geneticists continue to probe the hidden enigmas of the universe in search of the true protagonist of our biology. Deoxyribonucleic acid, or simply DNA. DNA molecules contain an enormous amount of information. If we were to write down all the information necessary for life that a molecule of DNA contains, and which includes actions as simple as eating an apple, we could easily fill a mini library with an encyclopedia of thousands of volumes. If we could, using a special method, unwind each strand of DNA in our body and arrange them one after the other to form a chain, the last molecule would be in deep space at a distance 500,000 times further away than the distance between the Earth and the Moon. The DNA code was extensively deciphered during the famous international project entitled the Genome, and since then it has been a source of wonder for scientists all over the world. Many researchers sympathetic to religious theories, study genetics in search of what they believe may be tangible proof of God's existence. Others, on the other hand, use DNA itself as an indisputable argument to prove that all living things come from a common ancestor, and thus are in line with Darwin's theory. In recent years, many molecular biologists have tried to resolve this eternal debate by seeking the collaboration of other scholars from other disciplines, such as sociologists, statisticians, linguists, and others to decipher the information contained in a large molecule in the best possible way. As a result, not only has the knowledge of the code been enriched, but in 2006, a second code was discovered, superimposed onto the first. Molecular biologists have discovered that the DNA code works somewhat like a linguistic system. In this way, specialized computer programs have managed, through a process of decomposition of the genome sequence into millions of parts, to decipher mini sequences contained in DNA, as if they were words within a larger encyclopedic volume. After subjecting these words to Zipf's law, a mathematical theory used in linguistic sciences because it is applicable to all human languages, from Chinese to Spanish, the scientists were amazed to discover that even the genetic code follows the principles dictated by the law itself. Zipf's law, in fact, in reference to its linguistic application, states that in any text, be it a book or an article, the most repeated word will appear many more times than the second most repeated word, which in turn will be repeated many more times than the third most repeated word, and so forth. This aspect represents, for many, an important indication of the existence of a higher intelligence that is involved, in some way, in the evolution and creation of our species. In addition, one wonders if, in addition to the two known codes, there are other languages hidden within the human genetic map. Tackling these DNA mysteries can be a real headache for many scholars. In addition, in this regard, it is interesting to also mention the so-called junk DNA. Scientists have found that the number of the genes active in our species and many other equally complex species is actually quite low. About 96% of our entire genome is practically useless. It doesn't perform any important function for our body. The rationale attributed by some scientists to this curious fact has been that this genomic portion is what makes us related to all the other species on the planet, including fungi, bacteria, and even extinct dinosaurs, and therefore plays no vital role in cellular functions. But it does show that evolution occurred over a time span of millions of years. This element of genetic similarity between our species and many other species on our planet should put an end to that debate regarding the origin of the human race, in favor of evolutionary theory. But instead, scientists have already discovered that the language stored in this so-called useless part could actually play an important role in the life of the body itself. Official members of the Genome Project declared in January 2007 that junk DNA may not have originated on this Earth through explainable chemical processes. In fact, Francis Crick himself, co-discoverer in 1953 of the double helix structure of the DNA molecule, observed that in nature there were no evolutionary elements prior to the DNA strands, but that the molecule simply seemed to have materialized suddenly overnight. The achievements of human beings over the centuries are nothing short of astounding. From the days when humans forged arrowheads to the present day, humanity has developed the ability to erect buildings on the sea, design supersonic aircrafts, monitor space from satellites, and build supercomputers. However, so far science has not been able to create anything so complex that it can be remotely compared to a cell or a DNA molecule. The basic unit of every living organism appears infinitely more intricate than any supercomputer ever created by man. Since Stanley L. Miller's 1953 experiment, in which the scientist managed to form a soup of organic molecules using electrical discharges, to the present day, science hasn't come very close to imitating genetic activity. However, the idea that a molecule, like deoxyribonucleic acid, may have evolved from earlier, simpler molecules unknown to humans in the remote past remains firmly entrenched in the circle of evolutionary scientists. But we can also say, beyond any doubt, that the molecular efficiency achieved in DNA, which contains all the necessary information for a living being to grow, reproduce, feed, and interact with others, seems to be, if not the work of a superior intelligence, at least one of the most breathtaking wonders of the universe. Man versus monkeys. An astonishing transformation has taken place in modern science. Many scientists shy away from discussing it, but there's a point at which science and religion do coincide. For many years, under the influence of liberalism and humanism, scientists tended to favor the logic of the noble savage. That is, the belief that man was originally a good and peaceful animal, and that only later, when corrupted by society and progress, became evil. Violence and evil are considered human problems, probably caused by the conflict between our intellect and natural instincts. This logic was underpinned by romantic notions of animal innocence, the moral purity of instinct, and the myth of the ape as a harmless, playful, and innocent animal. However, as science has progressed, these notions have collapsed like a house of cards in the wind. In the 1970s, science began to refine Darwin's theory of evolution. This refinement became known as sociology, or in journalistic terms, the selfish gene. It was popularized by Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, from which it takes its name. This discovery, which has now become conventional scientific wisdom, argues that the ultimate driving force of evolution is genes, the molecular unit of inheritance in a living organism. Maximizing genetic success ensures the transmission of certain genes to subsequent generations. This principle, however terrifying in its ramifications, is the state of current evolutionary theory. We need to abandon theories and debates about origins and consider the current state of humanity. There are many ways to look at evolution. Whether one accepts Darwinian evolution or a modification of it, or whether man's evolution has been manipulated by extraterrestrials, God, or other deities, or even if one believes we are part of a phase of a larger evolutionary cycle, theosophy, anthroposophy, etc., the fact remains that our current genetic heritage reveals infinitely more about our history. Science places modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens, at the center of the ape kingdom, yet our relationship with monkeys has always been a matter of conjecture. Humans are said to be part of the same lineage as orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. But the standard view of this great ape family tree is that humans and chimpanzees are more similar to each other than humans and gorillas are, because chimpanzees and humans have separated more recently. However, with the publication of the gorilla's complete genome sequence in 2012, this theory was turned on its head. Scientists have realized that much of the human genome is more similar to that of the gorilla than that of the chimpanzee. Although they may seem affectionate and lovable at first glance, extensive studies in nature have shown a much darker side of monkey behavior. Monkeys kill, rape, and torture. They defend their territory and intrude on the surrounding territories using guerrilla tactics. In various studies on monkey behavior, it is estimated that at least 40% of all mating cases have elements of violence, which would be interpreted as rape. Monkeys have a short-term memory when it comes to bonding. If a monkey leaves one pack to join another, the previous pack immediately becomes an enemy. Raids on other packs are frequent, bloody, and brutal, resulting in ambushes, torture, and death. Monkeys behave differently from many other animal species, and their aggression seems very similar to that found in human behavior. It is frighteningly clear that our genetic makeup is directly linked to the kingdom of apes. This raises some fascinating questions and queries. Monkeys are excellent breeders. They create many children and continually strengthen their genetic heritage with territorialism and brute force. Researchers in this field wonder why the genetic program would have created what we understand as the conscious mind. Many argue that intelligence has developed as a result of increased hand-eye coordination through the use of tools. However, many other species use tools, including monkeys. Monkeys are quick learners and use whatever they can find to crack open a nut, catch a fruit, or crush a skull. But apes did not develop a high level of intelligence. Only the progeny of Homo sapiens sapiens did. While most religions insist that matter is good and God is a creator, other more esoteric approaches, from the Vedas to the Gnostics, suggest that matter is dangerous at best, evil at worst, and that our creation was the result of a miscalculation or a deliberate act of giving birth to a self-destructive species. In the Mandean tale, we read of demons who mate with each other and whose progeny is the body and mind of man. In other Gnostic traditions, our mind is considered a mixture of light and dark. The role of the mind in human development has been ambivalent, to say the least. On the one hand, it is our saving grace. On the other hand, it holds us in bondage. According to Sitchin, the mind was genetically engineered to create a race of slaves. In this regard, there are several alien species, some wish to help humans, while many wish to keep us in bondage. Monkeys were difficult to control, so it was decided to develop a complex organ, the mind, which, although originally limited, could still be controlled more easily, keeping natural instincts at bay without completely eliminating them. Continuing with his argument, early religions and social structures would have functioned as control mechanisms to keep men in their predetermined roles. With the passing of time, however, the control mechanism became the instrument of liberation. Some men began to develop thoughts outside the spectrum of control, and one thought led to another, and eventually to a rebellion. Sigmund Freud argues that civilization exists only to the extent that it surpasses instinct. With the loosening of moral codes and the increase of a supposed freedom, crimes, rapes, murders, and social disorder arise. When the culture fails, the monkeys come back. And when man rejects tyranny, his instincts take over and a new tyranny, that of ape violence, comes into effect. He is trapped in the vicious circle. The Gnostics say that nature is a trap and that man's true self is stuck in an eternal game. When the majority of humanity became aware of its condition, it rejected the structures of social control, religions, governments, and so on, and tried to make it on its own. Thus, the forces of life, which exist beyond the contamination of matter, decided to intervene. For many millions of years, they have sent emissaries to explain to man his real constitution and the conflictual nature of his being. Figures like Jesus, Buddha, Gandhi, etc. Each of them has taught us that man is a hybrid being, a mixture of fallen matter and light. Man is a being divided into three parts: body, intellect, and spirit. The physical organism, the body, is composed of fallen matter and is innately violent and destructive. In a sense, it has its own consciousness. We could perhaps call it GE, genetic entity. The mind, on the other hand, was created as a control mechanism, but it evolved into something more. It desires dominance and works best under control, whether by a cult or an ism, or by TV and computer games. Its release is painful but necessary. The emissaries of the light have been giving mankind signs of awakening for thousands of years, but man doesn't listen to them. By the way, as soon as the emissaries die, their messages are distorted and thus become part of the social control mechanism. The third way. How did life on Earth begin? Attempting to answer this question has been more complicated than any other aspect of science or religion. But why? Because the answer, if it could be determined beyond any doubt, would reveal to us the deepest meaning of ourselves and of everything we see around us. And more importantly, it would demolish once and for all the thorny tangles of conscious and unconscious thoughts and beliefs that cause most of the bloodshed in the world. Currently, there are only two socially acceptable explanations. of how life on Earth came to be. Science insists that it developed by entirely natural means, without the help of any external source, be it divine or extraterrestrial. Religion insists, with an even stronger fervor, that life is the work of a divine creator, called by different names from the various religious communities of the world. There is no overlap between these two diametrically opposed points of view. There is no common ground on which to negotiate. Each believes that its position is completely correct, and that the other, therefore, must be completely wrong. A sense of certainty that's reinforced by the fact that each is able to open gaps in the logic of the other. Of course, people of faith are immune to arguments based on fact or logic. Religion implies a blind and total trust in its dogmas, however dissonant they may seem with reality. Furthermore, believers claim that there's not a shred of tangible evidence to support the idea that any species can transmute into another species over time and with a sufficient number of genetic mutations, which is the foundation of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. In the early 1800s, Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands and noticed that some species had developed distinct genetic adaptations to overcome the obstacles of the environment in which they found themselves in. For example, the beaks of finches had been modified to be able to eat fruits, insects, and seeds. The observation of these phenomena led Darwin to think that over a much longer period of time, the entire body could undergo genetic modifications to the point of practically transforming itself completely. Thus, only on the basis of this hypothesis, he published the famous essay, The Origin of Species, in 1959. Since then, Darwin and his work have been the subject of intense debate between science and religion. As if there were no possible explanation outside of this dualism, they forced us to choose one side or the other, as if looking for a more objective middle ground was impossible. As it has emerged, and as we have noted before, neither side is in total possession of the truth. Let's start with the refutation of the Darwinist theory. Scientists believe that life arose spontaneously from a mass of inorganic chemicals floating in Earth's early prebiotic seas. However, the water in those seas had to have had a specific degree of temperature for the inorganic chemicals floating in them to bind into complex molecules. Given this well-known reality, Darwinists were quick to postulate that the first spark of life would have undoubtedly been lit about 2.5 billion years ago. At that point, the land would have existed as land, and the sea would have existed as sea, though not in the forms we know today. But would the water in those seas have been cold enough to allow the chemical reactions hypothesized by evolutionary theory? For Darwinists, the answer to this question is undoubtedly yes. However, there is no scientific evidence for this. It is only a hypothesis perpetrated and taught as an empirical and indisputable fact. Even today, Darwinist hypotheses are believed as dogmas and taught as historical facts. Sometimes, however, these facts do not last long before they are disproved. For example, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity overturned Newton's theory of the speed of light. Similarly, scientific discoveries in the 1970s made it clear that the origin of life dates back to a much older time than expected, approximately 4 billion years ago, when the sun had just lit up and the protoplanets had just assumed the shapes and positions they still hold today. This theory is based on the discovery of fossils in Australia dating back to about 3.6 billion years ago. The fossils discovered in Australia were produced from the dead bodies of billions of prokaryotic bacteria, the earliest known forms of life on the planet. Prokaryotes are also considered to be the simplest forms of life, yet prokaryotes are by no means simple. They are tens of times larger than a typical virus, with hundreds of strands of DNA. It is therefore clear that prokaryotes are extremely sophisticated creatures compared to what is presumed to be the first form of life, which can plausibly be imagined to be even smaller than the smallest virus. In this regard, viruses cannot technically be considered living beings in the classical sense of the term. Being alive means having the ability to draw nourishment from the surrounding environment, transform it into energy, expel waste, and reproduce indefinitely. Viruses, on the other hand, need a living being to thrive. It therefore seems safe to assume that the living being precedes the virus in any case. But why is the discovery of some fossils dating back 3.6 billion years so important? Because it collapses the hypothesis on which Darwinism is based. Given that 4 billion years ago, the Earth was nothing more than a bubbling cauldron of lava, or the furthest you can imagine from an incubator of life. Needless to say, the discovery left scientists stunned. However, they were able to react without panicking. They collectively decided to carry on as if nothing had changed. No textbook had been rewritten to accommodate this new discovery. Teachers continued to teach the theory that life arose 2.5 billion years ago, and not 4 billion years ago, as they had done for decades, until another striking scientific discovery came along. In the late 1980s, a biologist named Carl Woese discovered that not only had life appeared on Earth in the form of prokaryotes about 4 billion years ago, but there was more than one type. Woese discovered that what had always been considered a single creature was actually made up of two distinct types of living subjects that he called archaea and bacteria. This unexpected and astounding discovery made one thing clear beyond a shadow of a doubt: life could not have evolved on Earth. Its early appearance in the fossil records and the presence of two distinct and relatively sophisticated types of bacteria could not have occurred spontaneously without favorable natural conditions. However, even this discovery was met with the same resounding silence as the previous one, and no textbook has ever been rewritten to take this into account. No teacher has ever changed their lesson. One of the reasons scientists oppose the disclosure of the truth is that it would profoundly change the financial landscape of many of them. Think of the millions and billions of dollars in taxes and subsidies that are spent each year trying to answer a question: does life exist beyond Earth? The two types of prokaryotes that appeared suddenly, practically overnight, about 4 billion years ago, offer overwhelming evidence that the answer is yes. It is clear that life could not have spontaneously animated itself due to inorganic chemicals in seas composed of glowing lava rather than relatively cool water. So billions of dollars in funding would vanish if scientists openly admitted that life must have come to Earth from somewhere else, because of course it couldn't have originated here. Another reason why scientists avoid the dissemination of new discoveries is the constant and incessant attacks by religious fundamentalists. In fact, many scientists would also be inclined to acknowledge the mistakes made in the past and to explore new theories, but they can't because of the religious fundamentalism that permeates our society. No religion accepts even the idea that there is life in the universe, and scientists, in order to keep them at bay, reject any discovery that comes close to this hypothesis. However, the main reason for the refusal of scientists to accept and to disseminate new theories about the origin of life is that the spontaneous animation of life on Earth is a fundamental tenet of their theory of human evolution. In fact, Darwinists insist that humanity is the product of the same prolonged series of gradual genetic mutations that, according to them, have produced every living thing on Earth. And, once again, all of this has happened through natural processes within the confines of the planet, without any outside intervention, be it divine or extraterrestrial. Life appeared on Earth spontaneously, period. It emerged in a complex and invulnerable form in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. In light of all this, the time has come to reveal how things really are. Life had been planted here. The idea of accidental planting has been explored in great detail by a surprising number of intellectuals, and even by some accredited scientists, such as the British astronomer Fred Hoyle. The theory of accidental seeding is called panspermia, and the idea behind it is that bacterial life arrived on Earth on comets or asteroids from other planets where it existed before they exploded and sent the pieces of it hurling through space to collide a few millennia later with our newly formed planet. A variant of this theory is called direct panspermia, which replaces comets and asteroids with capsules launched by alien civilizations to travel through space for millennia and deliberately arrive at our newly formed planet. However, the idea of conscious direction from any form of life outside of Earth's boundaries is most abhorred by science. So direct panspermia has received little more than polite derision from the establishment. However, although non-direct panspermia blatantly challenges the scientific principle that all life begins and ends within the confines of Earth, it has been accepted at least as a possible alternative to canonical theories. There have even been serious attempts to try to determine whether the materials needed to create life can actually be found in comets. But the fundamental point of this argument is not to suggest the obvious, that is, that one or more entities somewhere beyond our solar system came here when Earth had just formed, and for reasons unknown to us, decided to seed two types of prokaryotes, the most resistant forms of bacteria that we know of, and that, as far as we know, they are creatures specially designed to be able to thrive in any environment in the universe. No. The fundamental point is to accept for a moment the theory of direct panspermia to be faced with an infinity of questions. Have all the planets been seeded, or only Earth? Why Earth? Why 4 billion years ago, when it was a bubbling cauldron of lava, not a couple of billion years ago, when it cooled down? These are all valid questions, and many others can also be asked, but they all stray from the more important question. Why would anyone, or to be honest, anything, want to bring life here, whether on Earth or possibly on any other planet? This brings us to the crux of the matter. Has the Earth been deliberately terraformed? Terraforming, or earth shaping, is the hypothetical process of deliberately modifying the atmosphere, temperature, surface topography, and ecology of a planet or other stellar body to make it similar to the environment of its home planet, so that it becomes habitable and allows the terraformous species to continue living. The term was coined by Jack Williamson in a science fiction short story, Collision Orbit, published in 1942 in Astounding Science Fiction. Many scholars have carried out experiments to understand if this concept can be applied to our planet, that is, if it is possible to terraform another planet to make it similar to Earth, and, consequently, livable for human beings. Although Venus, Mars, and even the Moon have been studied in relation to the topic, Mars is generally considered to be the most likely candidate for terraforming. Many studies have been done on the possibility of warming the planet and altering its atmosphere, and NASA has even hosted scientific debates on the subject. Several potential methods for terraforming Mars could be within humanity's technological capabilities. But according to Martin Beach, the current political predisposition of favoring short-term profits over long-term investments will never support a terraforming operation. The practicality of terraforming is also a matter of debate. As the topic gained traction, research expanded to other possibilities, including biological terraforming, terraforming, and modifying humans to adapt to the environments of other planets. Despite all this, questions still remain in areas related to ethics, logistics, economics, politics, and methodology in altering an extraterrestrial world, presenting problems for the implementation of the concept itself. Yes, that's right. The concept of terraforming conjures up sci-fi cinematic images. We human beings, along with all the other life forms present on our planet, feel like protagonists on the stage, the Earth, that we believe is a small, elitist sphere in the vastness of a seemingly infinite universe. A disturbing and above all unlikely scenario, but one that must be faced. What if we were just supporting actors in a cosmic movie that's been running for 4 billion years? Is this fantastic idea really possible? Is it even remotely plausible? We look at the facts as we know them, not what we are led to believe by those we trust to inform us correctly. The simple truth is that life came to our planet when Earth could accommodate virtually nothing. The life forms that have been brought here, the two prokaryotes, are the simplest and most durable creatures we know of. and, more importantly, possess the unique ability to produce oxygen as a result of their metabolic processes. Why oxygen? Why is this so important? Because without an oxygen-based atmosphere, life as we know it today would be impossible. Oxygen is essential for complex life as we know it, and it is most likely necessary for higher forms of life everywhere. If that's the case, if oxygen is the key ingredient for life throughout the universe, then from a terraformer's point of view, bringing a load of prokaryotes into the solar system 4 billion years ago starts to make a lot of sense. Let's imagine ourselves in their shoes for one moment. Let's assume that they are on a planet far away from ours, and that they have reached millions or even billions of years of life as a species. Probably, space and time mean nothing to them. These are dimensions that, considering the technological and scientific levels reached after all these years, are able to govern easily. Thus, it is easy to hypothesize that interspace travel is a reasonable means for them to search out new places and planets capable of hosting life. Well, 4 billion years ago, they spotted a solar system, ours in this case, that was just forming. Then they sprinkled the planet with prokaryotes in the hope that one or more of them could survive or even thrive. Terraformers know that if prokaryotes eventually prevail over time, trillions of them will produce enough oxygen to give rise to life. Once this is done, after about 1 billion years, the oxygen produced by the prokaryotes will begin to saturate the waters of the seas and the atmosphere above. When the saturation is sufficient, let's assume another 1 billion years, terraformers can begin to introduce more and more complex forms of life to the planet. These include, for example, eukaryotes, Earth's second largest form of life, a single-celled bacterium that suddenly appeared and did not evolve like prokaryotes about 2 billion years ago. Eukaryotes stand out because they are the first life form with a nucleus, which is a hallmark of all terrestrial life except prokaryotes. We humans are eukaryotic creatures. But these second immigrants, who like prokaryotes still exist today as they did when they arrived, were much larger than their predecessors and more efficient at producing oxygen. After carrying out the first part of their program, the terraformers waited patiently for the planet to cool down enough to introduce even more complex forms of life. At the right time, starting about 500 million years ago, higher life forms were introduced through what is now known as the Cambrian explosion. Thousands of highly complex beings appeared almost overnight, male and female, predators and prey, that didn't resemble any living creature up to that point. That is what really happened. Terraformers continue to monitor their project. They note that the Earth undergoes periodic catastrophes that eliminate 50 to 90% of all higher forms of life, such as mass extinction events that actually occurred 5 times over history, the last of which was the Cretaceous extinction 65 million years ago, which wiped out all the dinosaurs. After each event, they wait a few thousand years while the planet regained its biotic balance. Then they repopulate it with new plants and animals capable of making their way into the post-catastrophic environment. This is also confirmed by fossil records. The scenario described so far may seem like a work of science fiction at first glance. It actually accounts for real, true material evidence far better than Darwinism or creationism ever did or ever will. This produces a paradox in the whole debate that cannot fail to be described with a touch of irony and bitterness. With hard evidence to support outside intervention as the originator of life on Earth, the concept is ignored to the point of suppression in both scientific and religious circles. This is understandable, of course, because discussing it openly could give it a credibility that neither side can currently afford to grant. Both sides have their hands full in keeping the battle against each other alive, so the last thing either one of them wants or needs is an inconvenient third party trying to ruin their plans. Conclusions. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how we perceive our teachers, whether we believe the extraterrestrial theory of our origins, or whether we perceive the history of our existence in more religious, psychological, or scientific terms. The reference point for all these paradigms is spiritual. Our mind is much more malleable than what we think, as it is subject to continuous intrusions that transform and change according to new challenges and the passing of time. Higher entities realize that man, at some point, could not be controlled by the genetic entity alone, so he evolved new gene-like structures to control his own mind, such as memes. A meme is a virus of the mind, a contagious idea that replicates like a virus, transmitted from mind to mind, which spreads through communication networks and direct contact between people. Memes shape consciousness to fulfill the directives of the original program of mass control. Memes turn significant social movements into oligarchic bureaucracies. They commodify ideals and values. They transform technological and scientific discoveries into mind control mechanisms. Television, video games, and sports are means to keep us from using our minds for any spiritual function, keeping them absorbed and controlled. Our whole culture is based on this premise. All thought must be controlled, even if occultly, so that true freedom is impossible to achieve. Many believe that they are outside the structure of control, but in reality, they are just part of it.